just like any other private property owner, you can hold on to that property. But if there's any question, if there's any doubt about the ownership of the property, it's much better for the security officer to ID the person, find out where they live, settle the question over the ownership of the property later. Don't try to take extraordinary steps to retrieve property when there's any doubt.
Can a security officer ever use force?
Security officer can use force in a circumstance where they're trying to prevent damage to property, where they're trying to prevent an illegal trespass on property, but only to the extent that the force is necessary to stop the trespass, to stop the damage. Again, any extraordinary force used by a police or a security officer in this area would not be supported. To the contrary, a police officer would have additional authority to take someone into custody and effect an arrest. Security guard should limit themselves to protecting the property at hand and then use only that force which is reasonable and necessary to do the job.
Are security officers ever required to read Miranda warnings to suspects?
Not at all. In fact, Miranda rights have been something developed by the courts, used in connection with public officials such as police officers. When acting on behalf of the government, they have to inquire into certain circumstances. Security guard really does not have any obligation or right to enforce these rights or to try to inform someone of those rights.
Mr. Port, you've briefly touched on the special state law regarding merchant premises and store security. Could you say some more about that?
In short, the state legislature some years ago in this state found it necessary to protect merchants to allow a temporary detention of someone who has taken property belonging to the merchant and has either secreted it on their person or has walked past the cash register with the intent not to pay for it. Under those circumstances, the state legislature said, look, it is reasonable for a merchant in the protection of their property to authorize its agents to detain the person long enough to determine the ownership of the property and then let that person go. In those circumstances, the key for any security officer is to keep that detention short, reasonable, and to limit any kind of physical force used to only that which is necessary. Any combative resistance at that point should be dealt with by the police and not by the security guard.
Are there any local ordinances that affect the authority of private security officers?
As a matter of fact, as a professional, a security guard really needs to know what laws affect the business that they're in. If they have to be licensed, if they have to be trained, all these things would come into play. And in some locales, there are ordinances and laws that are unique to that particular locale that a security guard, like any other professional, would have to know about. There are also some special laws that may come into play simply because a security officer in some instances might be armed. In those circumstances, they should be aware of laws such as the dangerous display of a weapon, which could be illegal under certain circumstances, or laws like you can't discharge a firearm in the city of Seattle, for example. I think those are the kinds of laws that could trip up a security guard under circumstances where they chose to be ignorant of the law. I think that they would run some jeopardy. They need to be informed, they need to ask questions, and they need to contact the local authorities and talk to police officers, frankly, about what laws govern them, especially in the criminal area.
Are there any laws prescribing what equipment security officers can carry or anything about vehicles?
The legislature in 1991 passed some laws that regulated security officers and security businesses with respect to the weapons that they carry and use on the job. It is expected under this new law that security guards will have extensive training through the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission on weapons use, when to use weapons, the appropriate use of a weapon under any circumstances. And with respect to vehicles, it is clear under this new law that security guards cannot operate vehicles that have imprinted on the sides words that refer to law enforcement or to police. The idea of these laws is not to allow citizens to be confused between police officers who have special authority to enforce the general laws of the state versus security guards whose authority is limited to the protection of private property or private interests.
Let me give you a situation here. A security officer is guarding a factory, and he sees someone run off the property with property that he knows belongs to the client.
In that case, as we've discussed a little bit, the interest to be protected by the security guard is the interest of his employer, his or her employer. If the employer has directed the security guard to try to protect the property using reasonable means, that's exactly what the security guard should do and no more. You don't want to run the risk of using any kind of excessive force or any kind of excessive means to obtain the property when, using good judgment, you can get a good identification of that person, write a clear report about the circumstances, and possibly have the police apprehend them later. But if it is clear you got a tugging match between the person who has something that's stolen and the security officer, he can use a reasonable amount of force to detain the item, not necessarily the person. Other than that, if you have combative resistance again, where the police should be brought in, that's very important to the security officer's job. In fact, I think most security officers should consider pre-planning so that they can avoid circumstances where they have to handle individuals by themselves and do not have appropriate backup. Often that backup should be the police.
Can the client give any special authority to the private security officer on private property?
Yes, they can. The one limitation that a client, meaning the owner of the business or the owner of the property, the one limitation they would have is trying to have security guards enforce rules which are illegal or which are unreasonable and therefore illegal. Let me give you an example. If a restaurant owner wants to limit someone coming on the premises that has shoes and shirt, as a rule, you have to have shoes and shirt to come in the premises, that's fine. But if they want to try to enforce a rule which under state law would be discriminatory, that you couldn't come on the property if you were a person of a certain religion or race, etc., then those kinds of rules really cannot be enforced by anyone, including the management themselves. So it's very important for management to set down rules that have been reviewed by their own attorneys to make sure they don't have these kinds of discriminatory aspects. And then the security guard should ask questions if they're uncertain in an area like this.
Mr. Port, on a different note, how can security officers' written reports serve as legal documents?
Many times security officers, just as police officers, are asked to give testimony in court. Sometimes, just by the nature of the business, a report written a year ago is going to be difficult to recall, especially if it's not reviewed thoroughly by either a police officer or a security guard. The rules are the same. When it's necessary to refresh a security officer about an event that happened some time ago, or even if it happened a few hours ago, it's important that the document accurately reflect what happened so that later on, in court, when you're, as a security guard, asked about the events and someone refers to the document, there won't be a conflict between what you say and remember and what you've written at the time of the event. So the importance of good, clear writing, taking the time to write that report and to review that report at the time is important to anyone who's going to testify in court. Security guards should remember that they're the eyes and ears of the court. When they write a report, they should not assume that any of the facts. They should simply reflect what they saw, what they heard, what they did. And especially when it comes to identifying persons that they come in contact with, it's important to be a good observer and then put those observations in writing. Yes, they can become legal documents, and I think it's an important part of the job to make a good record of the activities, especially when you as a security guard are expected to confront people on the job and take some action on behalf of your employer. It's a good practice for a police officer. It's a good practice for a security guard.
What might happen to a security officer who causes some sort of financial loss or actual damages to a client because of negligence? Example, falling asleep on post or not following security procedures outlined in their post orders.
Because the security guard is the agent of the employer, usually the employer is going to be sued for any of the acts done by the agent. If the agent is negligent, the employer can be sued. But also, the agent, in this case a security guard, can be sued in his individual personal capacity. Security guard certainly is going to want to be sure that for ordinary negligence, the company has a policy of protecting them and defending them. But we also have to remember that sometimes security guards, in given circumstances, may want to take additional steps of defending property or acting on behalf of the employer that are not specifically authorized. When you get into the area of acts that are not specifically authorized by the employer may drop back and say, hey, under these circumstances, you're beyond the scope and course of employment working for my company. In that case, you're going to be on your own. So that's why the importance of understanding the rules of the employer and what the security guard is supposed to do for the employer is really important.
Could you give us a little general education here and tell us the basic elements of a crime?
Well, I think we have to think in terms of laws in general have to do with things that society's decided are wrong. A criminal law which has to do with a specific wrong that society has addressed by the drafting a law that says, hey, if you violate this law, you may go to jail. That's the major difference between a law that's civil and a law that's criminal. Criminal laws usually have fines and jail as a penalty. Civil laws may have fines, but ordinarily that's the limit of what they do. In defining a criminal law, of course, the government has decided that the test of the violation of that law is intentional conduct. Intentional conduct. So the intent to commit the wrong is part of what has to be proved. On the civil side, however, ordinarily the intent is one of you violated the law. I'll give you an example. A security guard is regulated by a lot of laws that have just come on the books in this state. Violation of those laws ordinarily are just going to be a civil violation. Not having a license, not having the other parts of the requirements met. This could be a violation of civil law. But when you get into intentional wrongful conduct that's defined as criminal, there could be some exposure, and the possibility of committing a crime is real.
What's the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor?
The laws in the state that, and also in the United States, that are considered felonies are those for which the penalty is more than 1 year in jail. Misdemeanors are generally defined as those kinds of crimes that, if committed, the possible penalty is less than 1 year in jail. And normally in this state, that means you're going to go to the county jail versus state prison.
What concluding advice could you give security officers regarding their legal powers and limitations?
Well, first of all, I think in general, when you're working for an employer, you need to be thinking about using good judgment, asking questions when you're not sure about what your specific duties are. And of course, since you're in the business of preventing loss and protecting property, you need to be inquisitive. You need to have good work ethic when it comes to writing reports and capturing those details. Security guards really need to work closely with the police, especially in an apprehension situation. Police officers not only have the training, but they have the additional authority necessary to take people into custody and arrest them for criminal offenses. The security guard or security worker, on the other hand, by their presence can often deter crime, but without working with the police, they're only halfway I wouldn't say successful, but they're only halfway there in terms of how they can protect their employer's property. If they can apprehend what's going on, identify the person who's committing the wrong, write a good report, and work closely with the police, I think that kind of planning and that kind of dedication